I try not to label people the poor. I work with the poor because we don't do that to anybody else. A banker doesn't say, I work with the, middle class. I work with the wealthy. And yet we have no problem doing that and kind of categorizing people. And the other thing is poverty is something that affects the whole person. And the people I work with are not wholly poor. They may be economically poor, but they're some of the most spiritually rich people that we meet. And I think some of us as Americans would say that we suffer a spiritual poverty in this country, and so we could call ourselves very poor also. And yet, if you only measure poverty by economics, you're missing how it really does affect the whole person. And so what I try to say instead is I work with people that have very limited economic resources, or they have very limited access to capital to really, sustain themselves. That's their issue. They're some of the smartest people. I mean, I would hate to be put side by side to have to survive even a month on what they make do with. And so inventive, creative survivors would be an apt description of them. And so poor doesn't capture it. So that's one thing. I think we have to check ourselves about how quickly we bundle and label people. It really doesn't work. When I think of Luis Guadamus or Blas, the leaders, Ana Acuna, these are names and people in my head. I can see their faces right now. Some of the most dynamic leaders you would want to meet in villages in Nicaragua. And if you knew them, if you could talk with them and see what they're accomplishing, you would never be willing to say, lump them and say they are poor, because they are the leaders transforming their communities. That's who they are. And let me just make a comment about even just how we work in Nicaragua and how I've come to believe, we as outsiders can be useful to communities of limited resources. The first thing I'd like to just share is that I do think that where you start determines where you end up. And so if you start out looking as an outsider at the folk you're going to work with as poor, you're going to end up treating them as very different than who you are, because they're poor, right? And so think deeply about where you start, because it will determine the relationship you end up with, and it will also determine the choices that you make about your work. And so over the years, I've found a really useful set of concepts and ideas that actually came from John McKnight, who has really been a mentor my whole career, someone that I have learned a great deal from. And John came up in the 80s with this notion that we really should go into communities, those of us that are outsiders or leaders within a community, we should really go into communities thinking about the gifts that are here, the gifts, the talent, the businesses, the associations, the natural resources, the knowledge, the education of our folk, all of that if we really want to build a stronger community, let's look at all that stuff. Let's look at what we have, right? And then let's look at building that into more, whatever our dreams take us. That made just a whole lot of sense to me. But it's not usually how institutions work. institutions usually go into communities with limited resources and say, well, this is a really needy community. Well, look at how much they need. And they spend a whole lot of time quantifying up that neediness. The problem is, again, you then see the community through that lens. You see a whole lot of folk that are very needy. And instead of a whole lot of folk that have potential because they have particular gifts, particular callings, particular passions and dreams, and particular resources to who they are. And so where you start really does make a difference. And the term that's used is to say that if you start looking at the giftedness or the assets of a place, of people, of a community, your whole approach changes. And that's really what I've spent a lot of time